A crumbling palazzo holds its breath. In a lamplit chamber, Martina Bianchi lets a hush of piano soothe an ailing countess, unaware that a man listens from the shadows. His name is Alessandro di Sant'Angelo, heir to a fading house and prisoner of a past that refuses to sleep. One melody, one gaze she cannot see, and a choice already gathering, duty that binds or desire that awakens. The walls remember secrets, the city hungers for scandal. Tonight, everything begins with a single note, and nothing will remain untouched. Before we begin, share where you're listening from, and tell me, what do you love most in period romances? Rome, in the year 1821. The city wears late afternoon like a veil, sun softened to honey, bells drifting over stone, a whisper of the Tiber threading through narrow streets. Martina Bianchi steps from a modest hired carriage and stands before the Sant'Angelo Palazzo, a grand house that once commanded admiration and now seems to remember it with difficulty. The facade has surrendered its brilliance to weather and time. Flaked frescoes cling to plaster like memories to failing minds. Ivy climbs the courtyard wall in stubborn loops. A brass knocker shaped like a lion's head stares with the blind dignity of an ancient witness. Martina presses her palm to the cool metal and feels the tremor she did not want to admit. She's not afraid exactly. She's attentive, as one is when stepping into a church where silence carries the weight of confession. Her dress is of dove-grey wool, neatly mended at the hem. A white fichu softens her neckline, tucked with care. She wears sturdy half-boots, polished despite their age, and a simple wooden rosary hidden beneath a small cross pendant that rests against her skin. Over her arm hangs a folded shawl, the color of old smoke. In her leather satchel, sheet music is tied with faded blue ribbon. She inhales the faint perfume of orange blossoms from a courtyard tree and lifts the knocker. The door opens to a servant with a face like a careful ledger. He nods once, neither cold nor welcoming, and escorts her across a checkered marble floor broken by hairline cracks. The air smells of beeswax, dust, and a ghost of incense, as if mass had once been spoken in these rooms and never truly ended. Portraits of ancestors in powdered wigs line the corridor. Their painted eyes follow in a silence that is not empty but expectant, like breath held before a note is struck. The Countess awaits the music, the servant says in a low voice. She has not slept. Speak softly. Play gently. I will try, Martina answers. She has learned that music is sometimes the only language an aching body will not refuse. They pass beneath a gilt arch into a long gallery where the light dims and deepens. Velvet curtains hang heavy with dust. A clock ticks with patient authority. Somewhere above, a door opens and closes with a muffled thud, and footsteps cross a wooden floor, pause, and withdraw. The servant leads her to a room whose tall windows face a winter-pale sky and a garden that has forgotten its geometry. In that chamber, on a bed dressed in damask worn thin by devotion, lies Countess Isabella di Sant'Angelo. The Countess is not old in the way the poor are old, quickened by toil and sun. She is old in the aristocratic fashion, pale and finely made, as if chiseled from marble. Her hair, silver as frost, is braided and coiled beneath a lace cap. A shawl of faded plum nestles around her shoulders. Her eyes, hazel with gold flecks, drift from object to object as a boat drifts along a river when the oars rest. A small smile visits her lips and wanders away. "Signorina Martina," murmurs the maid at the bedside. "The lady has been restless. Perhaps the adagio you played at the interview." The maid gathers the Countess's thin hand between her own and smooths it with a tenderness that tells of years of service. Martina bows her head in greeting, then crosses to the instrument. It is a fortepiano of dark mahogany, its surface dulled by fingerprints and time. She trails her fingertips lightly across the keys, not to make sound, but to say hello to the thing that always understands her best. She sits, settles her skirts and lifts her hands. The first notes are barely louder than breathing. They rise and fall with the steady pulse of a heart at rest, an even tide that refuses the drama of waves. Martina chooses a melody shaped to cradle thought, rather than stir it, allowing silence to live between phrases, the way a listener's hope lives between words of comfort. The room receives the sound as parched earth receives a brief rain, quietly, greedily, with gratitude that is almost concealment. Countess Isabella blinks, and the unfocused sheen in her gaze softens. Her lips form a soundless syllable. The maid exhales the breath she had kept trapped near her throat. Martina continues, leaning into the intervals where sorrow becomes a kind of balm. She thinks of her mother's hands winding the rosary at night, of her father marking columns of numbers with exacting care, of the day both were gone, and she learned that a single afternoon can hold too much. The harmony deepens. Outside, a breeze stirs the curtains, loosing a faint powder of dust that the late sun turns to gold. The house seems to lean toward the instrument. The clock's tick slows in the ear until it becomes part of the rhythm, a quiet metronome for a human soul. Martina feels it then, the small mystery that visits her only when she is truly serving the music, that she and the instrument and the breath in the room are a single intention. Madonna, the Countess whispers, not to a saint, but perhaps to a memory. Cozy, cozy. The words are no more than a sigh, and yet they carry feeling. Her fingers, frail and ringed by the soft swelling of age, move as if they search for a hand that is not there. Martina shifts the melody to a simple variation and lets it hum at the center of the piece, like a lullaby remembered. She watches the Countess's face without staring, listens for the pulse of the house, visits the lowest notes like a mother visiting a crib, returning, 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 until the breath in the room changes from uneven to steady. The maid wipes a tear with the back of her wrist, pretending she was fixing a lace edge. A faint sound travels from the corridor, so faint that it might be imagination, a floorboard responding to weight, the sigh of wood that knows footsteps. Martina does not turn her head, yet her senses tilt in that direction. The door to an adjoining library stands half open, its interior shadowed, its shelves lined with leather spines, its carpet all but silent. She does not see anyone. Still, the hairs at the nape of her neck rise the way they do when a chapel door opens behind her during prayer. She plays on. The melody modulates, careful as the turning of a page, and the room brightens. Not with light, but with a gentler kind of attention. Martina feels watched, but not with the coarseness of curiosity. The gaze that finds her is observant, withheld, almost austere, and for an instant a heat rises to her cheeks that she scolds herself for. She is here to work. She's here to serve. She keeps her eyes on the keys, and in that choice there is a strange, fine pleasure, as if obedience were a ribbon tied around the throat of something wilder. The Countess hums now, scarcely audible, but in tune, as if she had kept this melody in a small pocket of herself for years and needed only permission to take it out. Martina lets the cadence lengthen, then lets it settle, not to an end, but to a rest, like the settling of birds on evening branches. She lowers her hands to her lap and waits. Silence fills the chamber. It is not empty. It holds the echo of what has been said, and the promise that it may be said again, if needed. The maid bends close to the Countess and whispers that it is time to close her eyes for a little while. The Countess obeys, drifting not into the rough sleep of exhaustion, but into the gentle surrender that music sometimes grants. "Grazie, signorina," the maid says. Her gratitude is both professional and human. She has not been so peaceful since the last feast day. "I am honored," Martina answers. She stands, presses her fingers very lightly to the polished edge of the instrument, and smooths the skirt over her knees. She gathers the shawl she had set aside and drapes it across her shoulders, though the chill in the room is more from memory than from weather. On the writing table near the window, a book lies open, its ribbon marking a chapter. A quill rests beside an ink bottle, as if conversation had paused only a moment ago. Martina hesitates, then diverts her gaze. It is not her place to read the private pages of a noble life. She regards instead the garden through the glass, a fountain stilled by disuse, hedges clipped long ago into forms that have softened into suggestion, a lemon tree attempting fruit against its better judgment. One could be forgiven for thinking the garden asleep. One would be mistaken. It listens, as houses and gardens do, for what will wake them. Martina gathers her satchel. A quiet shifts from the adjoining library, a change in air rather than sound, the sense a person has when someone has stepped closer and then reconsidered. She keeps her posture demure and calm. If she turns, she will look not at a person, but at a shadow. She knows this in the way she sometimes knows which chord will feel like home before she plays it. She dips her head, whether to the unseen presence or to the house itself she could not say, and moves to the door. The servant reappears without flourish, his step respectful of the new quiet. He leads her back through the gallery, past portraits that look less stern now that the air carries a residue of song. The clock assures the house that time has continued. On the landing, a draught finds Martina's cheek, and with it a faint fragrance, paper, wool, and the clean austerity of starched linen. Not cologne, not flowers, the scent of someone who prefers the invisible order of things to their display. At the top of the staircase, Martina pauses. She cannot help herself. She turns slightly, as if she had forgotten a thought in the corridor. The library door remains half open, its interior dark like the hollow of a hand. The feeling of being seen presses gently upon her once more, not to unsettle, but to steady, as if the house itself had eyes and wished to remember who had brought music back to its rooms. She does not smile. She does not blush. She simply lowers her lashes and continues downward. In the entry hall, the coat rack stands like a polite guard. A shaft of sun touches the marble near the threshold and paints it pale gold. Martina thanks the servant, whose expression softens by a hair's breadth, which in such houses is the measure of true sentiment. She steps into the courtyard, where the air is cooler and the world larger. The sky has turned the color of an aging silk gown, and the first star doubts itself in the west. She does not look back. She lets the memory of the fortepiano's voice travel with her, the way a prayer follows a person beyond a church door. The carriage waits, plain and sturdily kept. She climbs in, arranges her skirts with the economy of a woman trained to be tidy even in private, and rests her palm over the pendant at her throat. The driver, a man with a grey cap and a respectful silence, clicks his tongue, and the wheels groan into motion. Streets unspool under the carriage, stones worn by centuries of feet and hooves. The city breathes in a cadence of markets closing and lamps being lit. Martina watches the windows of houses passing by, squares of amber set into walls, each room its own small theatre of longing and fatigue. She thinks of the Countess's eyelids lowering at last, of the sudden calm that entered the room as if it had been waiting just outside, patient as a faithful dog. She also thinks, though she would not confess it to anyone, of that sensation of being watched in a manner that neither threatened nor presumed. It had contained discipline, and something wounded, and something like hunger strangled into silence. She tells herself it was the house. Old houses do that, especially those that have belonged to the same family for generations. They learn to keep secrets and to notice strangers. She tells herself this and finds that her pulse refuses to change. At her modest lodging in Trastevere, there will be a pot of soup kept warm by a neighbor, a window that sticks in the frame, and a single candle to stretch the evening. She will place the sheet music on her small table and smooth the ribbon. She will say a prayer of thanks for work that honors her hands. She will not, she decides, wonder who stood in the shadowed library or why the scent of paper and wool feels like a promise. She will simply be grateful that for one quiet hour, music mended what words had torn. The carriage turns, and the palazzo slips from view behind a bend of stone and ivy. Night approaches with soft authority. Rome gathers itself, as it always does, into the dignified riddle of what endures. In that riddle, a house remembers a melody, an old woman sleeps, and a young pianist carries home the echo of something she cannot name, only play. Rome, in the year 1821, rests between grandeur and decay. The papal banners still wave above domes and towers, but in the narrow streets below, poverty presses against splendor with relentless hands. Behind the walls of the Sant'Angelo Palazzo, however, time does not simply pass. It lingers, like incense after a mass, unwilling to leave. The house is old, its stones softened by centuries of prayers, secrets and betrayals, and within its silent chambers walks a man who has long chosen shadows over light. Count Alessandro di Sant'Angelo carries his years not as a number, but as a weight. At 34, he is tall, broad-shouldered, the posture of his youth trained by military discipline, yet his gaze betrays weariness more than pride. His hair, once jet black, now shows threads of silver at the temples, a crown carved by experience rather than vanity. He has returned from war with a scar etched along his forearm, though the deeper scars lie buried in his memory. Rome, which once greeted him as heir to an ancient name, now watches with curiosity and disdain, whispering of debts, failed crops, and a family that clings to reputation as ivy clings to a crumbling wall. Alessandro had grown accustomed to silence, but silence changed the day Martina Bianchi's music entered his mother's room. He had lingered in the adjoining library, not out of calculation but out of retreat, as he so often did. Surrounded by volumes of Cicero, Virgil, and modern treatises he rarely opened, he sought refuge in the smell of paper and the dust of history. It was there he first heard the delicate cadence of her playing, the humility in her touch upon the keys. He expected another hired girl, skilled perhaps but cold, one who would decorate the hours with sound and leave no imprint. Yet her notes had trembled with sincerity, fragile but resolute, like a prayer spoken not for show, but for need. That evening, as he sat alone before a solitary lamp, he replayed her music in his mind. The fortepiano had not sung with arrogance, it had whispered like a confidant. He could almost hear her breath between phrases, the way she leaned into the melody, as if offering part of herself to the silence. It unsettled him, this intimacy woven without touch, and it drew him in with the quiet force of inevitability. The next afternoon, Alessandro did not intend to reveal himself. He paced the corridors, his cloak brushing against tapestries that had seen better days, listening for the moment her music began. When it floated once more through the heavy air, he paused, leaning against the carved frame of a doorway, closing his eyes. But this time, something stirred in him, a rebellion against the secrecy of his own heart. He pushed open the library door, allowing it to creak, and stepped into the chamber where his mother dozed and Martina's hands shaped the air with melody. The maid gasped softly, startled by his sudden presence, and curtsied. Martina looked up from the keys, her dark eyes wide, her cheeks faintly flushed from the intensity of her playing. For a breath, neither spoke. The Countess slept, her lips parted in fragile peace. Alessandro inclined his head with solemnity, as though afraid words might shatter the delicate balance the music had created. "You play with devotion, signorina," he said at last, his voice deep and deliberate, tinged with the faint hoarseness of a man unaccustomed to speaking often. "It is not common, even in houses where music is a daily ornament." Martina rose quickly, curtsying with modest precision. "My lord, I only hope to ease her ladyship's rest. If the music has intruded upon your studies, I beg forgiveness." He shook his head slowly, his grey eyes fixed upon her as though trying to solve a riddle. "On the contrary, it has intruded upon my silence, which is not the same. Silence is an empty companion. Your playing filled it with something I had nearly forgotten. Martina lowered her gaze, for the intensity of his words unsettled her. She clutched the edge of her fichu as if needing the fabric's solidity. "I am grateful that it brought comfort." Alessandro did not answer at once. Instead, he walked to the window where the garden lay in disarray, branches tangling in rebellion against forgotten pruning. "Do you believe music can heal, Signorina?" he asked, still watching the lifeless fountain below. She hesitated. "I believe it can remind us of what is worth healing, my lord." He turned then, and in his gaze she glimpsed not the stern air of a noble family, but a man who carried unseen battles. That gaze lingered a moment longer than propriety allowed, and Martina, sensing the danger of it, returned to her seat at the fortepiano. She struck a chord, soft but steady, as though to anchor the conversation in something safer. In the days that followed, Alessandro arranged his steps with cunning simplicity. He never announced his intention, but he managed to cross her path in corridors, to pause near the salon when she rehearsed, to ask questions about the pieces she chose. Their exchanges began with music, but soon expanded to matters of thought. One afternoon, he found her adjusting the sheet music on the piano and asked, "Why this sonata? Why not a brighter one to lift her spirits?" She answered without looking up, "Because sorrow sometimes needs company, more than it needs denial. A brighter melody would mock her pain. This one speaks to it and therefore eases it." Alessandro studied her face, the firmness of her brow, the softness of her mouth, and felt the strange sensation of respect, rarer in his world than admiration. He asked her then about the philosophers she admired, and she spoke of Augustine's Confessions, of Seneca's letters, of how she found in their words an echo of music's purpose. He listened, surprised that a woman of modest origin spoke with such thought, though he knew better than to let astonishment reach his features. It was during one such encounter that Alessandro, almost against his will, spoke of his war years. They were seated in the music room after the Countess had retired to sleep. The air was heavy with the perfume of fading roses from a vase, and Martina was gathering her scores. "I marched across Europe in the service of men who no longer remember the names of those who fell beside them," he said suddenly, his voice low. "I carried comrades in my arms only to bury them in soil that was not theirs. I returned to Rome with laurels no one cared to crown, only debts and silence. That is why I avoid the world. It greets victories loudly and forgets defeats in whispers." Martina's hand froze upon the ribbon tying her sheet music. She lifted her eyes, meeting his with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Then you understand, my lord, that music cannot erase wounds, but it can remind us we are not the wound itself. It offers us a measure beyond pain." Alessandro inhaled sharply, as though the truth of her words pierced more deeply than he wished to show. He turned away, his profile etched against the pale light of the window. For a moment, the proud Count seemed nothing more than a man searching for air in a stifling room. Martina, sensing the weight of his confession, bent her head in respect, not daring to intrude further. Yet within her chest, a quiet storm had begun. She felt drawn to him not because of his name nor his rank, but because of the sorrow that shaped his dignity. Still, she reminded herself of the gulf between them. He was heir to a lineage, bearer of debts, yet still cloaked in nobility. She was the daughter of a fallen clerk, her livelihood bound to the mercy of aristocratic households. To step closer would be to risk ridicule, perhaps ruin. The days continued, and with each, their encounters became threads woven into a tapestry neither had intended to create. In the gallery, Alessandro would pause as she passed, offering a comment on the weather, on a book he pretended to be reading, on the history carved into the palazzo stones. In the salon, Martina would catch his gaze lingering on her hands as they moved across the keys, a gaze both disciplined and hungry. Their words never trespassed into intimacy, but the silence between words often did. One evening, as she prepared to leave, Martina descended the grand staircase and felt the press of eyes upon her once more. At the bottom, Alessandro waited, his cloak draped over one arm, his cravat slightly loosened, as if formality had grown weary. "You bring more life to this house than I could ever purchase with gold," he said quietly, almost to himself. Martina lowered her head, her breath unsteady. "My lord, you are kind, but I am only a servant with an instrument. Do not belittle what has power to awaken what even war could not destroy," he replied, his voice heavy with restrained intensity. For a moment, silence expanded between them, filled with the fragrance of candle wax and the faint echo of her music still clinging to the corridors. Martina curtsied, her heart pounding in a rhythm she dared not name, and stepped past him into the night air. Alessandro watched her go, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the shadow of battles both fought and unfought. The palazzo behind him exhaled its ancient breath, and he, the man who had lived in silence, began to understand the peril and promise of listening. Rome, in the year 1821, lives beneath a veil of contradictions. The streets bustle with markets, cries of vendors, and the fragrance of roasting chestnuts, while behind the gates of noble palaces, whispers grow louder than any clamor outside. Within the Sant'Angelo Palazzo, the corridors seem to listen more than they speak. Shadows bend across faded frescoes, tapestries flutter with secret drafts, and the very stones carry the weight of conversations never meant to reach the open air. It is in this hushed world of appearances and concealments that Cavaliere Cesare di Sant'Angelo sharpens his intentions like a blade. Cesare was a man fashioned not by war, like Alessandro, nor by quiet dignity, like the late Countess, but by ambition sharpened through envy. He stood of medium height, his hair slicked back with perfumed oil, his dark eyes restless as if forever measuring profit and peril. Though his coats were of fine cloth and his waistcoats embroidered with daring patterns, the extravagance carried the air of desperation rather than triumph. Every jewel pin on his cravat declared more loudly than words, "Look at me, remember I'm important." Yet the city remembered something else, that his fortune was thin, his credit uncertain, and his standing borrowed from the name he carried, not the wealth he possessed. For Cesare, Martina Bianchi's presence was intolerable. He had begun to notice Alessandro's silences were no longer the silences of solitude, but of attention, and that attention lingered where it should not. The Count's grey eyes, once hidden behind indifference, had started to follow the young pianist with a hunger he tried to disguise beneath civility. Cesare read those glances as clearly as a gambler reads the tilt of dice. He saw danger in them, not merely personal scandal, but the collapse of the plan he had been weaving with meticulous care. That plan carried a name: Marchesa Bianca Rinaldi. Bianca was a widow of only 29 years, wealthy beyond measure, her fortune secured by vineyards in Lazio and shipping interests along the Tyrrhenian coast. She was beautiful, yes, but in a way that drew admiration without warmth. Her skin was as pale as alabaster, her auburn hair arranged in elaborate coils held by tortoiseshell combs, her lips painted with restraint to suggest decorum rather than passion. She walked as if the earth itself bowed to the rhythm of her steps. But her eyes, those pale blue eyes, carried a coldness that revealed more than her gowns ever could. She had not survived widowhood by chance, she had survived by calculation. Cesare had courted her attention with flattery and promises, speaking of the Sant'Angelo name as though it were still gilded by power rather than tarnished by debt. He painted Alessandro as a figure of tragic nobility, burdened but redeemable, a man who only required the right alliance to restore the house to splendor. Bianca, who measured her prospects with a merchant's precision, saw in Alessandro an investment. To her, the palazzo was not decaying stone, but an opportunity to stamp her name upon history. She accepted Cesare's words with the serene silence of a woman who already knew how she intended to act. One late afternoon, the Sant'Angelo Palazzo received her. The gates opened to admit her carriage, its lacquer gleaming like wet ink beneath the waning light. Footmen dressed in matching livery assisted her descent. She emerged in a gown of emerald silk, its sheen casting ripples with every movement, her corseted figure held in impeccable posture. Pearls glimmered at her throat, and a lace mantilla of the finest Spanish weave covered her hair. She stepped across the marble floor of the hall, as if measuring its worth beneath her heels. Martina, arriving at that same hour to tend to the Countess, crossed the threshold of the palazzo just as the Marchesa entered. Their paths intersected for the first time, though not by chance. It was Cesare who had contrived the meeting, eager to let one pair of eyes measure the other. Bianca's gaze fell upon Martina with the precision of a jeweler appraising a stone. She saw at once the modest grey wool dress, the mended hem, the fichu tucked neatly into the neckline. She noted the worn boots polished by diligence, the small cross pendant at the young woman's throat. To any other lady, Martina might have been invisible, a servant carrying nothing but her humility. But Bianca recognized the subtle fire in her expression, the calm dignity that no poverty could erase, and in that instant she understood what Cesare had feared. This girl was dangerous, not because of her station, but because of her presence. "Who is this?" Bianca asked, her tone light, yet laced with curiosity, sharpened like glass. "Only the pianist," Cesare replied smoothly, his false smile curving beneath his mustache. "A hired companion for the Countess's hours. She comes and goes without consequence." Martina lowered her head in respect, though she felt the sting of those words. She offered a polite curtsy, her cheeks tinged with the faint color of discomfort. Bianca's lips curved in a smile that did not reach her eyes, and she glided past, her perfume of violet and amber trailing like a signature in the air. Later that evening, as Alessandro entered the salon, he found his cousin already seated with Bianca, the two conversing near the hearth. Cesare rose at once, exclaiming with feigned delight, "Alessandro, see who has graced us tonight. The Marchesa Rinaldi, a most generous friend of our family." Alessandro bowed with courtesy, though his features carried the reserve of a man who does not welcome surprises. Bianca inclined her head gracefully, her fan half open in her gloved hand. "The honor is mine, Count," she said. "I have heard much of your valor and your devotion to this house. Rome speaks of you as a figure of great dignity, though undeservedly withdrawn." Her words were smooth, but Alessandro's grey eyes darkened, as though hearing a compliment he did not trust. He offered her a seat, though his attention lingered, however briefly, on the sound of music rising from the adjoining room, Martina rehearsing a sonata for the Countess. The notes reached him like a thread, pulling him elsewhere. Bianca noticed the subtle turn of his head, the slight pause in his breath. Her eyes narrowed, and she followed the invisible path of his attention until she understood where it led. Cesare, ever watchful, leaned toward her with a conspirator's whisper. "Do not trouble yourself with passing fancies, Marchesa. My cousin indulges sentiment, but sentiment cannot pay debts. You and your dowry are the future of this house." Bianca closed her fan with a snap as delicate as the crack of ice. "Then ensure the future does not grow distracted by music played in servants' halls," she answered coolly. That night, whispers spread among the servants. They spoke of the Marchesa's arrival, of her jewels glittering in candlelight, of the way she had looked at Martina as though measuring an enemy. The corridors carried those whispers like wind through broken shutters until they reached Martina herself. She felt their weight, not in words alone, but in the sudden shift of glances when she entered a room, in the silence that fell whenever her name was spoken too near Cesare. Martina continued her duties with outward composure, yet inside her heart trembled with unease. She sensed forces gathering beyond her reach, currents stronger than the delicate notes she placed upon the keys. Still, when she sat at the fortepiano beside the Countess's bed, she played with the same sincerity, though every phrase now carried the hidden knowledge that somewhere in the house, powerful eyes measured her worth, not with kindness, but with calculation. For Alessandro, the intrigue grew like smoke he could neither see fully nor ignore. He felt Bianca's elegance pressing upon him with the weight of expectation, Cesare's schemes surrounding him like nets cast in silence, and Martina's music calling him toward a light he feared to touch. He stood between them, duty, ambition, and truth, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the choice he had not yet made. Rome, in the year 1821, lay wrapped in a restless spring. The winds carried the fragrance of orange blossoms from the gardens, yet still dragged dust from the neglected corners of the city. Within the walls of the Sant'Angelo Palazzo, however, the air remained heavy, touched by sorrow and expectation. Days passed in a cadence that no one dared disturb. The Countess's fragile breathing, the careful steps of servants who lowered their voices, and the notes of a piano that rose each afternoon like a fragile prayer. It was Martina who summoned that prayer from the instrument. She arrived daily, her grey dress pressed through plain, her shawl folded neatly across her shoulders, and her hands prepared not for grandeur, but for solace. She played with devotion, not as one seeking applause, but as one lighting a candle in the darkness of another's night. The Countess often stirred when Martina's music began, her eyelids fluttering as though she dreamed of another life, one where corridors were filled with laughter and not silence. For Alessandro, those afternoons became the only hours he allowed himself to breathe. He stood often in the shadow of a half-open door, listening not only to the sound of the keys, but to the pauses between them, to the soft intake of Martina's breath when she leaned into a passage, to the reverence with which she allowed silence its dignity. He told himself he watched only for his mother's sake, but he knew that was not truth. The music had become a fragile thread, binding his wounded heart to something it had long denied: hope. One evening, after the last note had faded and the Countess slept, Alessandro entered the chamber. The maid withdrew discreetly, leaving the two alone with only the flicker of candlelight and the scent of lavender oil burning in a small lamp. Martina rose at once, prepared to curtsy, but he lifted a hand, halting her with a solemn gesture. "Do not lower yourself before me," he said quietly, his voice carrying both command and plea. "You have already lifted what I could not. My mother finds rest not in medicine, but in your music. You have given her back a dignity the world had begun to strip away." Martina's dark eyes widened, and she clutched her shawl as if it might shield her from the force of his words. "My lord, I am honored to serve her ladyship, but I do nothing more than play. It is the music that comforts, not I." Alessandro stepped closer, the faint gleam of his signet ring catching the light. His gaze, grey and heavy with unspoken feeling, lingered upon her face. "Music does not play itself, signorina. It requires hands and a heart willing to give of itself. My mother senses that heart, as do I." Martina lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushed with warmth she could not master. She wished to step back, but her body resisted. In the stillness of the room, she felt the air grow charged, as though invisible threads connected them. She spoke with measured calm. "If I give, my lord, it is not because of who listens, but because it is all I know how to offer. Music has been my refuge, my bread, my prayer. Without it, I am nothing." His expression softened with something like reverence. He reached for a chair and sat opposite her, leaving space between them yet closing the distance of solitude. "Then it seems," he said, "that nothing has saved this house more than what you call nothing." Their eyes met. It was not a look of indulgence or presumption, but of recognition. Two souls who had carried burdens alone and suddenly found them acknowledged. The silence stretched, delicate, almost dangerous. Martina rose at last, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Forgive me, my lord, I must not linger. My place is at the instrument, not by your side." Alessandro inclined his head. accepting her withdrawal, though his gaze followed her with an intensity that lingered long after she left the room. In the days that followed, Cesare's eyes sharpened with suspicion. He had long feared the bond growing between the Count and the pianist, and now he began to see proof of it in every pause, every glance. Servants whispered that Alessandro spoke more often, that he no longer drifted through the house like a ghost. Cesare interpreted this not as renewal but as danger. He understood the power of rumor and wielded it with the ease of a seasoned conspirator. He began to speak in corridors, his tone lowered just enough to force ears to strain. "A shame," he murmured to a steward polishing silver, "that the young Count spends so much time in the company of one so beneath him. Whispers in the city can ruin a house faster than debt." To another he sighed. "Devotion is admirable, but devotion to a servant. What would the Marchesa think should she hear of such impropriety?" The words traveled like smoke, curling through servants' quarters and kitchens, seeping into chambers where silence had once reigned. Soon the very air of the palazzo carried insinuation. Martina felt it when she entered. The sudden hush of conversation, the glances exchanged over lowered lashes, the subtle tightening of lips. She bore it with composure, yet inside she trembled. One afternoon, while she arranged her sheet music, she found Cesare standing near the instrument. He leaned upon his cane, his moustache curving with a smile too polished to be sincere. "Signorina," he said with false courtesy, "your devotion to the Countess is admirable. Yet you must know how fragile reputations are. Rome is a city of tongues sharper than daggers. A woman in your station would be wise to keep her distance from matters beyond her reach." Martina's spine stiffened. She bowed her head in humility, but her voice, though soft, did not waver. "I serve her ladyship with honesty. If tongues sharpen their words, it is not I who place the whetstone in their hands." Cesare's eyes narrowed, the gleam of malice quickened by her quiet dignity. "See that your honesty does not become ambition. The Sant'Angelo name cannot afford another scandal." She answered nothing, returning to her seat at the piano. She let her hands fall upon the keys, releasing a chord that trembled in the air like defiance. Cesare's smile thinned, and he turned away, his footsteps echoing with irritation. That evening, when Alessandro entered the chamber and found Martina pale with unease, he approached her gently. "What has troubled you?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, touched with concern. She shook her head, unwilling to speak ill of his cousin. "Nothing, my lord, only the heaviness of the house." He studied her, his grey eyes searching hers for truths unspoken. He sensed the shadow Cesare cast, but Martina's restraint silenced him. Instead, he placed a hand upon the back of her chair, not touching her, yet close enough for his presence to steady her. "Then let the music lift it," he said, and she played. The notes rose into the twilight, fragile yet unyielding, carrying with them not only solace for the Countess, but a silent vow that, no matter the whispers, dignity would not be stolen from her hands. Alessandro listened, his heart bound ever tighter to the fragile thread woven by her music, a bond he both feared and cherished, aware that in the eyes of the world it was peril, but in the quiet of his soul it was salvation. The palazzo of the Sant'Angelo family, with its walls steeped in shadows and its corridors saturated with whispers, bore a silence that was no longer benign. It was a silence that waited, restless and insistent, as if the stones themselves held their breath for a revelation long concealed. Outside, Rome stirred with the life of early summer, but within those ancient halls, Martina Bianchi stepped with reverent care, her hands folded at her waist, summoned to aid Countess Isabella in arranging her belongings. The Countess, fragile and wan, reclined upon a cushioned chair near the window, her shawl draped loosely across her shoulders. The fading light fell gently upon her silver hair, turning each strand into a fragile thread of light. Her eyes, Hazel, with a mist that came and went like a tide, wandered between lucidity and forgetfulness. Beside her stood Alessandro, his tall frame steady, yet weighed by fatigue, his features cast in the golden light of the dying day. He had been restless of late, pacing, questioning accounts and studying papers, as though the truth of his family's decline hid just beyond his reach. "Martina," the Countess said, her voice trembling like a thin string, "open the chest by the escritoire. There are letters I wish to see once more, letters my husband wrote when he was a young man. Perhaps they will remind me of a time when my memory was not a stranger." Martina obeyed at once. She knelt before the chest, its brass fittings dulled by years of neglect, and lifted the lid. Within lay bundles of letters tied with ribbon, their paper yellowed, their ink faded. Beneath them, she found handkerchiefs embroidered with the family crest, small trinkets of ivory, and a rosary worn smooth by prayer. But as she adjusted the items, her fingers touched something else. A book bound in cracked leather, its edges darkened, its surface bearing the wear of secrecy. "My lady," Martina murmured, her brow furrowing, "there is something here. It appears to be a ledger." Alessandro, who had been watching with distracted thought, stepped forward. At the word ledger, his body stiffened as though a wound had been touched. He took the book into his hands, his long fingers brushing the brittle cover, his jaw tightening. "Give it to me," he said, his voice low, controlled. He crossed to the escritoire, lit a candle, and opened the book upon the desk. Martina rose slowly, drawn by curiosity and unease, and stood near enough to see the faded columns of numbers, names, and signatures. The ink was aged, but the entries were clear. Transactions recorded with precision, yet marked by discrepancies. Dates overlapped, sums were altered, and beneath the weight of numbers lay a story written not in words, but in deceit. Alessandro turned the pages with increasing urgency. His grey eyes narrowed, shadows deepening in their depth. "These accounts," he murmured, almost to himself. "These sums, they do not align with the official records." He traced a finger along one entry, his breath sharp. "Here, this speaks of missing funds attributed to your father, Signorina Bianchi." Martina's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly together. "My father?" Alessandro looked at her, his expression grave yet burning with restrained fury. "Yes. See here. The records show a deficit, and the initials of your father appear as clerk, responsible for the accounts. Yet here, hidden in this private ledger, the missing funds are transferred elsewhere. The signatures that follow are not his. They are—" His voice hardened. "They are Cesare's." The words fell like a bell toll through the chamber. Martina swayed, her lips parting in disbelief. For years, her father's name had been a shadow over her life, stained by accusation and whispered disgrace. It had closed doors, reduced her to the life of a humble tutor, and placed upon her heart the burden of injustice. Now, in a single moment, the truth glared from the faded ink. He had been innocent, and another had profited from his ruin. Tears welled in her eyes, not of weakness, but of a storm long caged. She pressed a hand against her mouth, unable to contain the trembling of her voice. He died believing the world had condemned him. He bore the shame in silence. Alessandro's hand tightened upon the ledger, his knuckles pale. His chest rose with the force of anger, his jaw clenched as if to prevent the roar of outrage from spilling forth. He looked at Martina, his gaze fierce, unflinching. "Your father was wronged, Signorina. Cesare used his name to shield his own theft, and my father, God forgive him, permitted the silence to stand." The Countess stirred in her chair, her frail voice breaking the heavy stillness. "Forgive me," she whispered. Her hazel eyes, lucid for a brief instant, rested upon Martina with a sorrow that pierced. "I knew. I saw the ledger once, but fear silenced me." Martina fell to her knees before the Countess, taking her fragile hand. "My lady, do not trouble your soul. My father is beyond this world's trials now. Her tears fell upon the Countess's hand, yet her voice carried strength. What matters is that the truth is no longer hidden. Alessandro closed the book with sudden force, the crack of leather echoing through the chamber. He paced the room, his cloak brushing against the chair, his steps heavy upon the marble. His fury was not wild, but contained, a storm chained within his chest. Cesare has stained this house with his deceit. He has stolen not only wealth but honor, and in doing so, he destroyed the name of an innocent man. I will not allow it to stand. Martina rose slowly, her face pale but resolute. My lord, do not endanger yourself for me. The truth itself is already a gift I never thought to see. To have my father's name restored, even in secret, is enough. Alessandro stopped before her, his eyes burning into hers, grey fire meeting dark earth. No, Martina, it is not enough. Your father deserves justice, and you deserve to walk without the weight of disgrace that was never yours. Their gazes held, charged with the electricity of unspoken vows. The chamber seemed to contract around them, as though the walls themselves acknowledged the moment. Martina felt the distance of class, the impossibility of their worlds, yet also the undeniable truth that his words were not born of duty alone, but of something deeper, something perilous and precious. She lowered her gaze, her voice soft. If you defend me, my lord, the city will say it is not justice, but sentiment. Alessandro's lips curved in a bitter smile, more sorrow than mirth. Let them say what they will. I have lived long enough in the silence of cowardice. I will not let lies govern what remains of this house. The candle flickered, casting their faces into shifting light. Martina felt the pull of his presence, the solemn dignity of a man who had seen battlefields and now waged a war within the walls of his own home. She trembled not with fear, but with the dangerous tenderness that grows in the soil of truth. A servant entered quietly, bowing, announcing that supper had been served. Alessandro dismissed him with a wave, his eyes never leaving Martina's. The servant withdrew, but not without noticing the tension in the air, and already Cesare's rumors found fertile ground. Martina gathered the letters she had set aside, placing them gently in the Countess's lap. She forced composure into her posture, though her heart beat with unsteady rhythm. Alessandro closed the ledger once more and pressed it beneath his arm, as though it were both weapon and burden. When she finally turned to leave, her steps echoed softly against the marble floor. Alessandro's voice halted her, low and deliberate. Martina, your father's name will not remain in darkness. I swear it upon my honor. She paused, her back to him, her hands trembling at her sides. She closed her eyes, and a single tear traced her cheek. She did not turn, for she knew that if she met his gaze again, the fragile boundaries she had erected would crumble. With a voice barely above a whisper, she answered, "Then may God give you strength, my lord." The chamber fell into silence once more, but it was no longer the silence of resignation. It was the silence before a storm. A silence that carried the weight of secrets unearthed, of honor betrayed, and of a fragile bond deepened by the fire of truth. Rome, in the year 1821, was a city where rumor walked faster than truth, and where a single whisper could ruin a reputation more swiftly than a duel. In the narrow streets outside the Sant'Angelo Palazzo, voices rose in markets and taverns, carrying tales of politics, of scandal, of noble names that had fallen into disgrace. Within the walls of the palazzo itself, that same poison began to stir, fed not by chance, but by the deliberate hand of Cavaliere Cesare di Sant'Angelo. Cesare had always known how to sharpen lies until they gleamed like truth. Now, with the discovery of the hidden ledger threatening to unravel his careful schemes, he struck back with ruthless precision. His cane tapped across the marble corridors like a judge's gavel, his smile fixed with false civility as he spread his venom. Servants were called aside, merchants quietly summoned, a magistrate approached with carefully chosen words. Cesare whispered that Martina Bianchi had manipulated the fragile countess, forged accounts, and seduced Alessandro into defending her. It was not theft, he said, but something more dangerous: ambition in the guise of humility. The rumors grew as ivy grows, clinging to every wall, slipping through every crack. By the time Martina arrived one morning to play for the countess, she felt their weight in the glances of the household. The maids avoided her eyes, the steward greeted her with tight lips, and 2 footmen exchanged a smirk that cut deeper than any word. Alessandro met her at the door of the salon, his expression grave but protective. His grey eyes, normally stern, now carried the storm of barely contained fury. He offered his hand to guide her inside, a gesture so simple yet so charged with meaning that Martina's heart trembled. "You must not listen to their whispers," he said quietly, his voice low so that only she could hear. "They are Cesare's doing. He fears the truth we uncovered." Martina lowered her gaze, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. "But what if the whispers grow louder than the truth, my lord? What if the city believes him?" Alessandro straightened, his broad frame casting a shadow across the pale light of the window. "Then I will fight the city itself if I must. I will not allow your father's name, nor yours, to be dragged through filth." Before Martina could answer, the door opened and Cesare entered, his figure wrapped in confidence, as if he owned the very air. At his side walked Marchesa Bianca Rinaldi, radiant in a gown of deep sapphire silk, her pale blue eyes sharp as blades. She carried her fan like a weapon, snapping it open with deliberate elegance. "My dear cousin," Cesare said smoothly, "and Signorina Bianchi." His voice lingered on Martina's name with poisonous sweetness. "How fortunate that we are gathered here, for matters of family reputation cannot wait. I have taken the liberty of inviting the Marchesa, whose sense of propriety is known throughout Rome. She will see that truth prevails where falsehood seeks to hide." Martina's heart clenched, but she rose, curtsying to Bianca with humility. The Marchesa inclined her head, her smile faint and cold, her eyes sliding over Martina as one might glance at a stain upon marble. Alessandro's jaw tightened. "Cesare, you bring accusations without honor and without proof. Do not think I will allow you to shame her under my roof." Cesare spread his hands in mock innocence. "Proof, cousin, is precisely what we must discuss. The ledger so conveniently discovered by this young woman, what assurance do we have that it was not forged by her own hand? After all, she alone handled it before presenting it to you. Ambition can make clever conspirators of the most unassuming souls." The accusation struck like thunder. Martina's face paled, yet she held her composure. Her dark eyes rose to meet Cesare's with quiet dignity. "I have no hand in deception. My father's name was tarnished by lies. If I wished for ambition, sir, I would not have chosen the path of service and poverty. I seek only to give peace through music, not to profit by deceit." Bianca closed her fan with a decisive snap. "Cavaliere, such accusations must not be spoken lightly. Still, the city watches, and appearances matter more than intentions. A count must be above suspicion, and a family must guard its honor. Surely you understand, Count Alessandro." Alessandro turned his gaze upon her, his grey eyes like steel. "What I understand, Marchesa, is that my cousin fears losing what he never rightfully possessed. Signorina Bianchi is guilty only of honesty, something rare enough in these walls." Cesare's smile faltered, though only for an instant. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper meant to wound. "The city will not see honesty, Alessandro. It will see a nobleman enthralled by a servant. It will see impropriety. It will see shame. And when the Marchesa's dowry slips away with her reputation, it will be you who bears the ruin." Bianca's chin lifted at those words, her face a mask of composure. Yet beneath her calm, a flicker of unease crossed her eyes. She had staked her reputation upon the possibility of marrying into the Sant'Angelo name, but scandal could tarnish her as surely as it could Martina. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but the edge of calculation was sharp. "Cavalier," she said, her voice smooth but taut, "perhaps we must be cautious. If the city believes there is impropriety, then my own name risks being drawn into the shadows. I did not come here to defend scandal." Martina, hearing those words, felt both shame and relief. Shame that her name could soil another, relief that even the Marchesa hesitated to be Cesare's weapon. She clasped her hands tightly before her, her knuckles pale, her heart pounding in her chest. Alessandro stepped forward, his cloak sweeping behind him, his voice cutting through the tension. "Enough. If you wish to accuse Cesare, bring your proof before the magistrates, not in whispered poison through my halls. Until then, remember that I am still master of this house." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the Countess's weak call from the adjoining chamber. Martina moved at once to attend her, her skirts brushing against the marble floor. As she passed Cesare, she felt his gaze upon her like a dagger, but she did not flinch. Inside the Countess's room, Martina knelt by her side and began to play softly, her fingers trembling on the keys, yet steadying as the melody unfolded. The music filled the chamber, wrapping around the frail woman like a veil of calm. Yet Martina's own heart knew no calm. She felt the weight of scandal pressing upon her, the eyes of the city waiting to judge, the gulf of class widening like a chasm at her feet. Still, when Alessandro entered quietly, standing behind her as she played, she felt his presence steady her. His eyes did not touch her with pity, but with resolve, as if he had chosen already where his loyalty lay. And in that silent exchange, as fragile as the trembling notes of her song, Martina found a courage she had not known she possessed. For though the house shook with rumor, though Cesare's lies slithered through the corridors, though Bianca's cold ambition hovered like a spectre, the bond that music had woven between her and Alessandro held firm. It was delicate, yes, but it endured, like the faint light of a candle that refuses to be extinguished by wind. The air in Rome had grown heavy with the weight of summer. Even within the Sant'Angelo Palazzo, where thick stone walls held the day's heat at bay, the atmosphere seemed charged with a strange expectancy, as though the very house anticipated an ending. Servants moved quietly, their steps softened by an unspoken reverence. The Countess's illness, once a shadow lingering at the edges of the family's life, now consumed the center of it. Every breath she took was measured, every sigh a signal, every silence a warning. Countess Isabella lay upon her bed draped in damask that had faded from crimson to the pale of old wine. Her silver hair was braided and pinned beneath a lace cap, her cheeks drawn, her lips pale. Yet her hazel eyes, though clouded by weakness, still carried an ember of the strength that had once commanded respect in the city. She drifted often now between memory and oblivion, her words sometimes senseless, sometimes piercingly true. On that evening, Martina sat at the fortepiano in the corner of the room, playing a melody so soft it was little more than a murmur. Each note hung in the air like a thread of incense, meant not to stir, but to soothe. Alessandro stood near the window, his tall figure framed against the light of dusk. His arms were folded, his jaw tense, his grey eyes fixed not upon the garden beyond, but upon his mother's frail form. It was then that Isabella stirred and, with surprising strength, lifted a trembling hand. "Martina," she whispered, her voice as thin as parchment. Martina rose at once, crossing the room swiftly yet with quiet steps. She knelt beside the bed and took the Countess's hand gently into her own. "I am here, my lady." The Countess's gaze searched her face with sudden lucidity. "Child, you must forgive me." Martina's heart stilled. "There is nothing to forgive, my lady. You have shown me kindness." "No," Isabella said, her voice gathering strength though it trembled. "There was a day, many years ago, I saw the ledger. I knew that your father's name bore blame that was not his. Cesare was clever, and I was weak. I chose silence to preserve the family's honor. I watched as a good man was crushed beneath a lie. Martina's eyes filled with tears. Her breath caught, and for a moment she could not speak. She clasped the Countess's frail hand more tightly, as though her grasp could carry absolution. My lady, you owed me nothing. My father bore his cross with dignity. He would have forgiven you. The Countess's lips quivered. And you? Will you forgive me? Martina bent her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yes, my lady, with all my heart. A sigh escaped Isabella, a sigh that carried relief and sorrow entwined. Her gaze shifted toward Alessandro, who had moved closer, his face carved with anguish. She lifted her other hand weakly toward him. My son, I have failed you too. I should have defended truth, not silence. Promise me you will not repeat my cowardice. Do not let pride destroy what honor should save. Alessandro knelt on the other side of the bed, his large hand covering hers. His eyes burned with unshed tears, his voice hoarse. I promise, mother, I will not allow lies to govern this house any longer. Isabella's gaze softened, her eyes moving between her son and the young woman who knelt beside him. For a moment her features held a serenity that defied her illness. She pressed Martina's hand faintly and whispered, You brought music back to my last days. Do not let them silence you. The effort exhausted her. Her eyes closed, and though her breath still came, it was shallow, faltering. The room grew still, the only sound the faint rustle of curtains in the evening breeze. Martina remained kneeling, tears falling silently. She had not expected such a confession, such a plea, and her heart ached not only for her father's memory, but for the frailty of the woman who had carried such silence for so long. Alessandro stood slowly, his face pale, his lips pressed into a line of grief. He looked at Martina, and in his eyes she saw the conflict of a man torn between duty and desire, between the world's expectations and his own heart's demand. The news of Isabella's decline spread quickly through the household. Servants whispered in corners, their faces shadowed by sorrow, but also by unease. Cesare walked the halls with the air of a man already measuring his inheritance, his cane striking the floor like a claim upon the house. He looked upon Martina with thinly veiled contempt, as though the Countess's blessing had only deepened his resolve to drive her out. Bianca Rinaldi returned to the palazzo the following day, dressed in mourning tones of grey silk, though her composure betrayed not grief, but calculation. She stood beside Cesare in the grand hall, her fan tapping softly against her palm, her blue eyes cool and observant. The city will be watching, she murmured to him. A death in the Sant'Angelo family will stir questions. Appearances must be guarded more than ever. Cesare inclined his head, his lips curling in a smile that did not touch his eyes. Appearances are mine to command, Marchesa. Alessandro grows soft, blinded by a servant's tears. It is we who must preserve what remains. Martina, hearing fragments of these words as she passed, felt the wound of them, but forced her steps onward. She returned to the Countess's side, refusing to let malice steal from the old woman her final comfort. She played softly, sang a hymn under her breath, and kept vigil as night descended. When dawn broke, Countess Isabella exhaled her last breath, her hands folded peacefully upon her chest. The palazzo was plunged into silence so profound it felt like a weight pressing upon every stone. Bells tolled in the distance, their solemn tones echoing through the city, announcing to Rome that another noble name had entered history. Alessandro remained at her bedside long after, his eyes fixed upon the stillness that had replaced the fragile rhythm of her life. He was devastated, not only by loss but by the burden of her final words. He felt the weight of a vow that demanded courage against enemies both within and without, a vow that bound him to truth even as it threatened to tear him from everything else. Martina, though her heart broke for him, knew she must keep her distance. She had been blessed by the Countess's confession, entrusted with her forgiveness, but she was still of humble birth, a servant in the eyes of the world. To linger too near Alessandro in his grief would be to invite suspicion and feed Cesare's lies, and so she withdrew, her heart heavy, her eyes wet, carrying within her the memory of the Countess's last words, words that felt less like farewell and more like command. The house of Sant'Angelo now stood at the edge of change, trembling between loyalty and betrayal, between honor and scandal. And Alessandro, the heir who had hidden too long in shadows, now faced the cruelest of choices: to obey duty's call, or to listen to the voice of his own heart, a voice that grew louder each time his eyes found Martina in the silence of the halls. The Sant'Angelo Palazzo, once a symbol of nobility, now stood at the edge of collapse, its gilded mirrors reflecting not grandeur, but tension. The death of Countess Isabella had left the household hushed, the air so heavy with grief that every footstep seemed to echo louder than it should. Yet beneath the mourning veil, another storm brewed, a storm Cesare believed he could control, and one Alessandro could no longer delay. The day of reckoning arrived with deliberate ceremony. Cesare himself had insisted that the family gather in the Grand Salon, a chamber built to impress visiting dignitaries and cardinals, but now filled with uneasy glances. Tapestries of ancient victories draped the walls, though their colors had faded. Chandeliers hung with wax-dripped crystals reflected the wan light of afternoon. The very room smelled of dust and expectation, as if it sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Alessandro entered first, his tall figure commanding silence. He wore a dark frock coat, somber and unadorned, his cravat tied with austere precision. His grey eyes, stern and unflinching, scanned the room with the gaze of a man who had walked through battlefields and returned not weaker, but more resolute. Martina followed at a respectful distance, her dove-grey dress modest, her shawl folded neatly over her shoulders. She carried herself with humility, yet there was a quiet strength in her posture, as if she bore not only her own fate, but the dignity of her father's memory. Cesare, by contrast, greeted them with ostentation. His waistcoat of burgundy silk gleamed in the candlelight, and the jeweled pin at his cravat sparkled with arrogant defiance. He leaned upon his cane, tapping it lightly against the marble floor with the rhythm of a man who believed the stage was his. At his side stood Marchesa Bianca Rinaldi, dressed in emerald silk, her pale blue eyes surveying the room with practiced calm. Her fan opened and closed with precise movements, betraying more nerves than her face revealed. Servants gathered at the edges of the salon, some holding trays, others pretending to dust surfaces already polished. They were witnesses, though no one named them as such. The steward stood rigid near the fireplace, his gaze flickering between Cesare and Alessandro. The air was thick with silence. Cesare cleared his throat, his voice carrying a false warmth. "Cousin, Marchesa, esteemed household, we meet today not for quarrel, but for clarity." Whispers spread in Rome, whispers that could tarnish the noble name of Sant'Angelo if not addressed. It is said that accounts have been tampered with, that false accusations have been made, and that, his eyes slid deliberately to Martina, those of lower station have dared to entangle themselves in matters beyond their reach. A murmur rose among the servants. Martina lowered her gaze, her hands folded tightly before her, though her face did not betray fear. Alessandro stepped forward, his voice steady and low. "Enough of whispers, Cesare. Today we deal in truth." From beneath his cloak, Alessandro produced the ledger, its cracked leather cover visible to all. Gasps rippled through the room. Cesare's eyes widened, and for the first time his confident smile faltered. "This book," Alessandro continued, holding it aloft, "was hidden in our mother's chest. Within these pages lies proof of what you did, Cesare. Proof that you shifted blame upon an innocent man, Martina's father, while you lined your own pockets with what you stole from this house." Cesare's face flushed crimson. He stepped forward, his cane striking the floor with force. Lies, forged evidence placed in the hands of a gullible heir. Can you not see, cousin, how you have been manipulated by a servant girl's tears? The insult struck the room like thunder. Martina's lips parted, her chest rising with restrained emotion, but Alessandro's voice silenced the uproar. She is no manipulator, Cesare. She is the daughter of a man wronged by your deceit, and today I restore his honor. With deliberate calm, Alessandro laid the ledger open upon the great table. Servants leaned forward, eyes wide as the inked columns revealed their secrets. Dates that contradicted, sums that vanished, signatures that did not belong. The steward stepped closer, adjusting his spectacles, and nodded with grim certainty. These marks, they are the cavalier's hand. I have seen him sign such figures before. Cesare lunged suddenly, seizing the ledger with desperate hands. The crack of leather echoed as he tried to tear its fragile pages. Gasps filled the salon, the servants pressing back, Bianca stiffening in shock. But Alessandro was quicker. His hand shot out, gripping Cesare's wrist with the force of a soldier who had once fought for survival. "You will not destroy the truth," Alessandro said, his voice low and dangerous. He wrenched the ledger free and set it firmly back upon the table. Cesare staggered, his chest heaving, his face twisted in rage. Bianca's fan snapped closed, her voice sharp. "Cavaliere, you have disgraced not only yourself, but those who dared to trust you. Do you realize what this means for me? For my name, if I am tied to this scandal?" Cesare turned to her, his expression desperate. "Marchesa, you must not believe him. You know my loyalty." But Bianca cut him off, her voice cold as marble. "I know only that Rome will hear of this, and I will not have my estates or my reputation soiled by your corruption. Consider our association ended." She swept her skirts aside, stepping away from him as though his very presence were a contagion. Cesare's face contorted, his composure crumbling. He looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only stares of disdain. The servants murmured, their whispers now carrying not fear, but condemnation. The steward crossed his arms. The maid who tended the Countess shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears of relief. Alessandro's voice rose, commanding, "Hear me all. The name of Bianchi is cleared. The shame placed upon Martina's father was a lie, and the truth has now been spoken. Cesare di Sant'Angelo, you are stripped of your place in this household. You will leave Rome in disgrace, with no inheritance, no title, and no claim to this family's honor." The words rang like judgment itself. Cesare staggered back, his cane clattering against the marble floor. His eyes blazed with fury, yet he saw in Alessandro's gaze a resolve he could not break. "You will regret this," Cesare spat. "You think the city will respect you for dragging your own blood into the dirt? You think truth is stronger than power? Rome will laugh at you." Alessandro stepped closer, his face a mask of steel. "Let them laugh. Honor is not measured by what Rome says, but by what God knows. And I will not carry the weight of silence any longer." With that, Cesare was escorted from the room by the steward and 2 footmen. His protests echoed through the corridors, fading until only silence remained. Bianca, her pride wounded, gathered her skirts and lifted her chin. "I will return to my estates. Rome will hear that I distanced myself before the stain spread. You may keep your truth, Count Alessandro. It will not serve you in society." With those words, she swept from the salon, her emerald gown trailing like the closing curtain of a drama. The room remained still, the servants staring at Alessandro with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Alessandro placed his hand upon the ledger and looked at Martina. His grey eyes softened, though the weight of responsibility still lay heavy upon him. "Truth is fragile," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "But silence is far more dangerous. Let this house stand upon truth, even if it trembles." Martina's heart ached at the sight of him, so strong and yet so burdened. She lowered her head in reverence, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. Around them, the grand salon seemed transformed, not into a place of triumph, but of cleansing. The air, heavy with dust and deceit, now carried the sharp clarity of revelation. And though the Sant'Angelo name trembled that day, it trembled upon the foundation of truth, not upon the fragile mask of silence. The bells of Rome tolled the hour of dusk, their solemn echo weaving through streets crowded with whispers and eyes quick to judge. Martina Bianchi, her heart heavy with both vindication and shame, walked swiftly through the narrow alleys that led away from the Sant'Angelo Palazzo. She carried no trunk, no bundle of belongings, only a small satchel pressed tightly to her chest as though it held the remnants of her dignity. Though the truth had been unveiled and her late father's honor restored, the tongues of society did not fall silent. To them, she was not the courageous daughter of an innocent man, but the dangerous young woman who had dared to capture the attention of a noble heir. Every glance, every murmur, every rustle of silk dresses as ladies turned their heads in contempt, cut into her resolve. She had decided she could not remain. The palazzo, once a refuge filled with music and quiet hope, had become a stage for scandal. Rome itself, with its glorious piazzas and ruined temples, now felt like a prison whose walls were formed of rumor. Martina believed her only salvation lay in retreat, in disappearing from the city that had branded her both savior and sinner. Yet as she walked with hurried steps along a deserted cloister that opened into the fading light of the Campo Marzio, a figure emerged from the shadows. Broad-shouldered, tall, his presence both imposing and tender. Count Alessandro di Sant'Angelo stood before her, not in his gilded palazzo, but beneath the humble arch of an ancient portico. His cloak swept around him, the wind tugging at its folds, and his eyes carried a fire that neither scandal nor shame could extinguish. "Martina," he spoke, his voice low but fervent, as though uttering her name was both prayer and plea. She froze, the satchel slipping slightly from her grasp. "You should not be here," she whispered. "If anyone sees us together, let them see," Alessandro interrupted, stepping closer. The evening light touched his face, casting shadows that deepened the gravity of his scars and the sincerity of his gaze. "For too long I have lived as though I were a ghost, caring more for the whispers of others than for the truth of my own heart. No longer." Martina shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do not speak so recklessly. Your name has only just escaped ruin. My presence will drag it back into darkness. I cannot bear to be the reason Rome turns against you again." Alessandro reached for her hand, but did not force it. Instead, he let his fingers hover near hers, trembling with restrained longing. "It was never Rome that saved my soul, Martina. It was you. Your music broke the silence in which I had buried myself. Your courage unmasked the lies that chained my family. You believe you bring me disgrace, but in truth, you are the only light that has touched this palazzo in years." Her breath faltered. She wanted to believe him, to surrender to the strength of his words, but fear clung to her heart. "And what of your cousin's whispers? What of Marchesa Bianca's ambition? What of the salons where noblemen weigh every gesture, every word, every silence? I am no lady of Rome. I have no title, no dowry, no lineage to shield me. Do you think titles have saved me?" Alessandro's voice cracked with passion. "Do you think fortune has spared me grief? My scars are not only of war, Martina. They are of cowardice, of nights when I hid from my duty, of days when I allowed corruption to taint my bloodline. You speak of what you lack, yet you are the only one among us who has never bowed to fear or greed. It is I who am unworthy of you." The confession stunned her, more piercing than any declaration of love. She felt the air between them tremble with the force of truths too long suppressed. Slowly, he closed the distance and, with trembling reverence, lifted her hand to his lips. His kiss lingered not with desire, but with devotion, as though sealing a vow. Martina's tears fell then, not of despair, but of release. Yet even as warmth surged through her, the weight of society pressed down. She withdrew her hand gently, her voice breaking. "Alessandro, love cannot build walls high enough to silence Rome." "Then we shall not build walls," he said, his eyes fierce with resolve. "We shall open doors. The palazzo that once reeked of decay and secrets will be reborn, not as a mausoleum for a fading title, but as a sanctuary for music, for those children who, like you once were, hold no power but their gift, no shield but their dignity. Together, we will transform the Sant'Angelo Palazzo into a school where women and children of humble birth can learn, can dream, can raise their voices in defiance of silence. That will be our answer to gossip, not retreat, but creation." His words struck her like a chord struck at the piano, reverberating through every hidden chamber of her soul. She saw, in that vision, not only her salvation, but her father's redemption, the continuation of his honor through the gift of music. Yet doubt lingered like a shadow at the edge of the candle's flame. "And when the nobles laugh," she asked softly, "when they call you a fool for choosing a commoner over a marchesa, when they sneer at a palazzo filled not with banquets but with children's voices?" Alessandro drew himself tall, his presence a tower of defiance. "Let them laugh. Let them sneer. Rome has thrived on the decay of its own hypocrisies for centuries. Honor does not live in approval, Martina. It lives in truth. If courage is all we leave behind, then our legacy will be greater than theirs." The silence that followed was not empty but brimming with unspoken longing. Martina felt the tremor of her own heart, the fragile thread that connected her fate to his. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not dictated by gossip, but by purpose. She looked into Alessandro's eyes and saw not a count weighed by duty, not a soldier scarred by war, but a man who loved her with a force greater than fear. Still, she hesitated, her voice trembling as she asked, "Are you certain? If you choose this path, there will be no turning back." "I am certain of nothing in this world," he admitted, his hand finally clasping hers with the weight of destiny. "But I am certain of you." The night fell fully then, the lamps of the city flickering to life around them. In the distance, the Tiber glimmered under the moonlight, as if bearing witness to their pledge. Martina closed her eyes, her tears mixing with a smile of fragile hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in love, not as a dream, but as a defiance. When she opened her eyes, Alessandro was still there, his hand holding hers as though anchoring her to a world she had thought herself unworthy of. And in that moment, beneath the ancient arches of Rome, they both understood that their love was no longer a secret whispered in the dark corridors of a decaying palazzo. It was a fire that would blaze against the cold scorn of society, a bond forged not in privilege, but in courage. Martina leaned closer, her voice barely more than a breath. "Then let it be so. Let us face them together." And Alessandro, with a smile born of both triumph and tenderness, whispered, "Against the world, if we must." Their hands entwined, they stepped out from the shadows into the heart of Rome, no longer fugitives of gossip, but architects of a legacy that would dare to challenge the very order of their time. And though the whispers followed them through the night, so too did the echo of courage, resonating like a melody that would never fade. The seasons had turned, and with them the spirit of the Sant'Angelo Palazzo. What had once been a decaying shell of faded grandeur now breathed again with life and purpose. Months of tireless work had transformed its corridors. Dust swept away, crumbling frescoes restored, shattered windows replaced with glass that caught the sunlight like crystal. Where silence had once ruled, the air now quivered with the promise of music. The scent of beeswax polish mingled with that of freshly cut laurel branches, laid in garlands to welcome those who would witness a rebirth. The city had whispered, doubted, even scorned, but Rome could not resist curiosity. And so, on this evening of the inaugural concert, carriages lined the cobblestones before the palazzo. Nobles in silks and velvets emerged, their jewels glinting beneath the lanterns, while modest townsfolk pressed closer at the gates, eager to catch a glimpse of what defiance had wrought. Within the grand salon, whose walls had once echoed only with grief, anticipation hummed like a held breath. Rows of chairs had been arranged, polished until they gleamed. A dais held the grand piano, restored from years of neglect, its ivory keys shining once more as if thirsting for the touch of hands that would awaken them. Martina Bianchi stood at the edge of the salon, her gown of pale silver grey, chosen not for opulence, but for dignity. The fabric caught the light of the chandeliers, making her appear almost otherworldly. Her hair, gathered in an elegant coil, was adorned only with a single pearl comb, a reminder of simplicity amidst grandeur. Her heart raced as she gazed upon the gathering audience. Senators and marchesas, scholars and matrons, young students seated nervously in the front rows. Each pair of eyes seemed to weigh her, some with admiration, others with suspicion. Yet she held her chin high, her hands folded calmly before her, though every pulse in her body betrayed the storm within. At her side, Count Alessandro di Sant'Angelo moved with the poise of a man transformed. He no longer carried himself as the reclusive heir consumed by shadows, nor as the soldier broken by war, but as a leader whose scars had become emblems of endurance. He wore a dark coat of velvet, trimmed with sober embroidery, no unnecessary adornment, for his authority no longer needed gilding. His gaze swept across the room with confidence, but when it fell upon Martina, it softened, carrying within it both pride and an unspoken vow. The murmur of voices dwindled as the guests settled, their fans fluttering, their jewels clinking softly. A hush descended when Alessandro stepped forward, his voice steady, resonant, and clear. "Friends, neighbors, citizens of Rome," he began, the timbre of his words echoing across the vaulted ceiling. "You have been called here not to witness the preservation of nobility, but its transformation. This house, which for centuries stood as a monument to privilege, now opens its doors to all who carry within them the seed of music. It is no longer mine alone, nor bound by bloodlines or coin. Tonight, the Sant'Angelo Palazzo is reborn, not as a fortress of shadows, but as a sanctuary of truth, of justice, and of song." His declaration struck the assembly with power. Some gasped softly, others exchanged glances, uncertain whether to applaud. But the moment belonged not to their judgment, but to the music that followed. Alessandro turned and extended his hand to Martina. She stepped forward, her palm slipping into his with a tremor that was both fear and devotion. Together, they approached the grand piano. As she seated herself, the candlelight shimmered upon the polished wood. Martina let her fingers hover above the keys, her breath catching as memories surged. The night spent soothing Countess Isabella's fading mind, the hours stolen in silence when her music was her only refuge. This piano had once been her confessional, her sanctuary, her secret. Now it was her voice before the world. Her eyes flicked briefly to Alessandro, who gave the faintest nod. His presence, steadfast and unwavering, steadied her, and then she began to play. The first notes rose gently, fragile as morning dew, yet with each chord they deepened, spreading warmth across the salon. The melody she had chosen was one that carried the memory of the Countess, the same hymn she had played to calm the noblewoman's wandering spirit in her last lucid hours. It was not a grand symphony, nor a virtuosic display, but a simple, poignant piece that spoke directly to the heart. As the music unfurled, silence claimed the room. Even the most skeptical guests felt themselves stilled, their breaths held captive by the purity of sound. The young students at the front leaned forward, their eyes shining as if glimpsing their own futures through the music. The older matrons dabbed discreetly at their eyes, moved by memories the melody awakened. For Alessandro, standing behind her, it was as though the shadows of war, scandal, and sorrow dissolved, leaving only the radiance of the woman before him. Martina's hands moved with grace, her face illuminated by something greater than mere light. She poured into each note her father's vindication, the Countess's absolution, the courage Alessandro had gifted her, and the fragile hope she carried for the children who would one day find sanctuary in these halls. When the final chords faded, they did not vanish into silence, but into a profound stillness heavy with emotion. For a heartbeat, the salon remained breathless. Then, like the breaking of dawn, applause erupted, thunderous, relentless, rising like waves crashing against the marble walls. Nobles and townsfolk alike stood to their feet, their clapping joined by cries of "Brava" and "Viva" that rang through the chamber. Martina rose from the bench, her chest heaving, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Alessandro stepped beside her, their hands intertwining before the gaze of all. They stood together as equals, their shoulders aligned, their hearts unmasked. "Tonight," Alessandro proclaimed above the applause, "we honor not only music, but the courage to defy silence. Let this palazzo no longer be known for its shadows, but for the light that truth and compassion bring." In that moment, Martina felt as though the walls themselves listened. The frescoes, once dulled by dust, gleamed anew under the candlelight, as if centuries of sorrow had lifted. She thought of Cesare, cast into exile, his name spoken only in hushed tones of disgrace. She thought of Bianca, vanished to her estates, her ambition crumbled into irrelevance. Yet neither their fall nor their whispers mattered now. What endured was the sound of applause, the promise of children's voices yet to come, the certainty that love and truth had triumphed. Alessandro turned his gaze to her, and though surrounded by hundreds, the world seemed to narrow until it was only the two of them. In his eyes she saw not the count, not the heir, not even the man scarred by war, but her companion, her partner, in a destiny they had chosen together. His lips moved in a whisper meant only for her. "This is our beginning." Her smile trembled, radiant through her tears. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice unshaken. "Our beginning." The applause continued, a tide that would not recede, and Martina allowed herself to bask in it, not as a woman vindicated, nor as a tutor elevated, but as herself, whole, beloved, and unafraid. The hymn she had once played for the dying had become the anthem of the living, of a legacy forged in shadows, but reborn in light. Thus the Sant'Angelo Palazzo lived again, no longer a relic of fading nobility, but a sanctuary where truth and music intertwined. And in its rebirth, the world saw not scandal, but triumph, not disgrace, but the power of love against the weight of silence. Martina and Alessandro stood hand in hand, illuminated by the golden glow of chandeliers and the thunder of applause, their hearts no longer burdened by secrecy. In that triumphant instant, they were not bound by shadows but lifted by music, forever united, forever remembered. The year was 1830, and the Palazzo Sant'Angelo no longer bore the scent of dust and despair. Its stones, once cracked and weary, now gleamed with renewed strength, not as a fortress of nobility but as a beacon of hope. For 8 years, its halls had rung not with whispers of scandal, but with music, piano scales faltering under a child's uncertain hands, voices rising in timid unison, then soaring with confidence. Where silence had once pressed like a shroud, laughter now spilled like sunlight. Martina Bianchi, now Countess di Sant'Angelo, stood at the tall windows of the grand salon, gazing out upon the gardens where children ran freely, their laughter mingling with the birdsong of spring. Her gown was simple, suited to a woman who had no need of jewels to claim her dignity. Her hair, now touched with the faintest threads of silver at the temples, framed a face marked not by weariness, but by serenity. At her side stood Alessandro, his figure still strong, though softened by time. His war scars remained, yet they seemed less like burdens now, more like inscriptions of a life fully lived. Their love had endured the weight of years, not by avoiding trials, but by meeting them hand in hand. They had faced harsh winters when funds for their music school ran thin, and nights when Martina awoke with doubts gnawing at her. Yet Alessandro's steady presence and her unwavering devotion had been their shield. They had built not merely a marriage, but a legacy, a union that carried within it both passion and purpose. 2 children played among the roses. Isabella, 7 years old, with her father's grey eyes and her mother's smile, and Lorenzo, 5, whose laughter echoed like a melody in the halls. They were the heirs not to wealth or title, but to a vision. Already, Isabella stretched her small hands over the piano keys, determined, while Lorenzo trailed after the students, begging to sing with them, though his voice still stumbled between notes. The city, once scandalized by Alessandro's defiance and Martina's rise, had grown accustomed to the transformation. Whispers had given way to respect. Aristocrats who once dismissed the palazzo now sent their own children to study within its walls. Merchants, scholars, and widows found solace here, watching their daughters learn music once denied to them by circumstance. Rome itself had changed, if only slightly, its rigid walls of class softened by the undeniable proof that dignity could be born of truth rather than privilege. Yet not all destinies had softened with time. Cesare di Sant'Angelo, exiled and disgraced, had never returned to Rome. Rumors drifted occasionally, a sighting in Paris, whispers of debts in Vienna, but his name had faded into the shadows he once wielded. His downfall had been complete, and though Alessandro seldom spoke of him, Martina knew there were nights when the Count's silence bore traces of regret for a cousin who had chosen ambition over honor. Bianca Rinaldi had retreated to her estates, her beauty preserved, but her influence withered. She had sought other alliances, yet none endured. Alone in her marble villa, she remained a reminder of ambition turned hollow, a woman who had gambled on power, but lost to love. Her name, once poised to rule the salons of Rome, was now mentioned only with pity or disdain. Martina sometimes thought of Countess Isabella, whose last words still lived within her heart. It was for her, too, that the palazzo had been reborn, and for the wrongs she had silently endured. In every child's voice lifted in song, Martina heard echoes of forgiveness, a hymn that healed wounds once carved too deep for words. That evening, as the sun set over Rome and bathed the city in a golden glow, Martina and Alessandro gathered in the Grand Salon for the anniversary concert. Students, teachers, and neighbors filled the chamber, just as they had on that night 8 years before, when the doors first opened. Martina sat at the piano once again, her daughter beside her, her husband just behind. As her fingers brushed the keys, she felt the passage of time settle upon her like a mantle, not heavy, but luminous. The hymn she played was the same she had once offered to a dying countess, the same she had transformed into an anthem of beginnings. Now it was a song of endurance, of lives reshaped, of shadows turned to light. As the final notes lingered in the air, Alessandro leaned toward her, his hand covering hers upon the keys. His voice was low, meant only for her. 8 years, and still I find myself astonished by you. Martina smiled, her eyes glistening. And I by you, Alessandro, always by you. The applause swelled, filling the chamber with warmth. Children clapped with abandon, nobles rose to their feet, and Rome once more bore witness to a triumph, not of wealth or title, but of love. Thus, the tale of Martina and Alessandro closed not with shadows, but with light, an enduring light that time could not dim, a love that had defied scandal, exile, and grief. And as the music soared through the palazzo, their legacy was sealed, not as rulers of men, but as guardians of harmony, whose love had not only survived the years, but made them glorious. Every story leaves behind more than words. It leaves a mirror in which we can see ourselves. Martina and Alessandro's journey reminds us that love, when joined with truth and courage, can overcome the deepest shadows and transform even the most fragile beginnings into lasting legacies. Their tale is not just about romance in a palazzo in Rome, but about how dignity, forgiveness, and resilience can rewrite any destiny. Now, I would love to know your thoughts. What lesson did this story leave in your heart? If you made it all the way to the end, write the word legacy in the comments. That way I will know you walked hand in hand with these characters until the very last note of their song. If you feel moved and wish to support the team that makes these stories possible, you can send us super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount you can or wish. Every gesture means the world to us. And if supporting this way is not possible, sharing this story with your friends and loved ones is another beautiful way to help. Do not forget, there are more stories, equally intense and full of passion, waiting for you. I invite you to explore the other narrations I have left for you in the cards. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being here and for letting this romance become part of your journey. May the echoes of this love story inspire you to face your own shadows and to transform them into light.